On August 6, 1945, one American bomber destroyed most of Hiroshima, and the argument that broke out inside the Japanese government over the next 2 days was not about whether to surrender. It was about physics. The cabinet took the American radio announcement at face value, and there were men in it who wanted it to be true. Because the Potsdam terms had been sitting on the table since the end of July, and Hiroshima gave them something heavy enough to move the army with. The army did not take it at face value. The post-war record of the Japanese decision preserves the army's position without softening it. That the explosion had not been an atomic bomb at all, but a super bomb using already known explosives. That was a technical claim rather than a political one, which meant it could be settled, and Imperial General Headquarters settled it the way any competent staff settles a technical dispute, by sending people who could measure the thing. An aircraft went south with a scientific team aboard. Professor Yoshio Nishina, the senior nuclear physicist in the country, walked the ground and reported on the 8th. He described a city with almost nothing left standing. And he wrote that the so-called new type bomb is actually an atomic bomb. 2 days after the event, in a country being burned out from the air with most of its transport gone, the Japanese government held a correct scientific finding produced by its own people as intelligence work that was fast, and it was right. It answered the smaller of the two things they needed to know. Nishina was the obvious man to send because he had spent 4 years failing to build one. The Army had funded his program, known as NAGO, and the Navy ran a second effort of its own. Nishina's people worked through bomb theory, through the separation of uranium-235, through the production of uranium hexafluoride and the measurement of the physical constants, and arrived at a conclusion that was accurate and no use to anybody. Such a weapon was possible in principle and out of reach in practice, at least for them. The distance between that laboratory and the officers paying for it survives in one exchange with Nishina's military liaison who, having been told that 10 kilograms of uranium would be needed, asked, why not use 10 kilograms of a conventional explosive? That is not a stupid question. It is the question of a man who has been handed an answer resting on an industrial plant the size of a town, with no framework for what such a plant would look like. So the second question, the one that governed what Japan should do next, went to men whose entire professional experience said the thing was close to impossible. It concerned quantity rather than physics, and it was simply how many more of them the Americans had. Nobody in Tokyo could answer that. Nishina could describe what had fallen on Hiroshima down to the mechanism. He had no way to say how many more sat in a hut on an island in the Marianas or how fast the hut refilled. Because none of that was physics, and there was no route to it from inside Japan. Well, to the south, the VII Fighter Command was flying that same week off Iwo Jima, and its Mustangs had been running very long-range missions against the home islands since April 7th, when the 21st Fighter Group escorted B-29s to the Nakajima Works and became the first land-based fighters over Japan. By that summer, the work had shifted from escort to low-level strafing because there were fewer and fewer Japanese fighters coming up to be escorted away from. First Lieutenant Marcus McDilda of the 46th Fighter Squadron flew one of those sweeps into the Osaka area on the morning of the 8th and did not come home from it. How he came down is not settled in the sources. Some accounts have him hit by anti-aircraft fire, and some have his engine fail, and the two cannot be reconciled from what survives. What is agreed is that he took to the parachute at low altitude over water off the coast, and that he was in Japanese hands within minutes of reaching it. 3 groups shared that very long-range work, the 15th and the 21st from March, and a third joining them in May. And between them they flew 51 of these missions before the war ended. The round trips ran past 1,500 miles, most of it over open water, with no diversion field and no landmark, and many of the pilots had fewer than 300 hours in a logbook. He was 23, from Dunallen in Florida, and had studied a little chemistry at school. He had no connection to the Manhattan Project and had never been briefed on it. What he knew about the new weapon was what the radio had said, which is what every other American serviceman in the Pacific knew. The Kempeitai put two questions to him. How many atomic bombs did the Allies have, and which cities were next? Those are the right questions, and it is worth saying so. Because the easy version of this story treats Japanese military intelligence as a joke, and on this occasion it was nothing of the kind. Inside 48 hours, those men had identified the precise pair of facts on which the remainder of the war turned. They then found themselves holding a captured American aviator taken out of the sky over Japan 2 days after Hiroshima. No intelligence service anywhere would have asked him anything else. McDilda told them he knew nothing about it, which was true, and the answer was refused. Under a threat he understood to be final, he changed it. And what came out was an invention assembled from school chemistry and whatever sounded weighty. He described atoms being split into positive and negative charges. The two kept apart inside a lead-shielded container, the shield melting as the container fell, the charges rushing together, the atmosphere over a city thrown outward and then dropping back as one crushing blow. No part of that describes a fission weapon. No part of it describes anything at all. Asked for the number, he said 100. And asked which cities he named the only two he could name, Tokyo and Kyoto, and said within days. Every element of it was false. All of it went down on paper, and the men writing it down had no independent means of testing a single word. That is the real subject here. And it has very little to do with one lieutenant. Japan could measure the bomb. Japan could not measure the factory. What the leadership needed in the second week of August was a production figure, and production figures for the United States were the one class of fact Japanese intelligence had never once managed to read. They had guessed low on aircraft, on merchant shipping, on carriers, and on landing craft, and every guess had been corrected by the arrival of the things themselves. American factories were turning out close to 100,000 aircraft a year by 1943. More in 12 months than Japan managed across the entire war. The plants that made the bombs sat a further step out of sight than any of that. Oak Ridge in Tennessee had been laid out as a small town, had outgrown that plan several times over by 1945 and appeared on no map. Its gaseous diffusion plant ran to more than 500 buildings and included what was at that moment the largest building on Earth, and the whole of it existed to produce a few grams of uranium-235. At its height, the project carried over 125,000 names on its payroll, and it was compartmented so hard that almost none of them could have told anybody what they were making. An American pilot who did not understand how the bomb worked was not an unlucky choice of prisoner then. He was the standard product of a system built so that knowing was rationed, and Japanese intelligence was trying to read the output of that system from outside it through a physicist whose own uranium separation had failed. The estimate Tokyo formed for itself came out of Nishina's laboratory rather than out of Tennessee, and it said what that laboratory was bound to say, which was that this is nearly impossible, so they cannot have many. Nobody in this story was incompetent, and it went wrong anyway. Because the one thing worth knowing sat somewhere neither side's methods could reach. Locating those places is the work this channel does, and a subscription keeps the results arriving. What happened to McDilda next shows how seriously the statement was taken. He was reclassified as a high-value prisoner and flown to Tokyo the following morning, which was not a casual use of an aeroplane in August of 1945, with aviation fuel in the state it was in. In Tokyo, they put him in front of a civilian scientist who had taken his degree at the City College of New York, a man who spoke English and understood what he was hearing. The invention did not survive the interview. One qualified examiner needed a short conversation to establish that the prisoner had no idea what fission was, and McDilda told him as much himself, explaining that he had given them the truth first, that they had refused it, and that he then had to tell the lie to stay alive. He was fed and put in a cell, given one competent man. Japanese scientific intelligence corrected its own error inside a day. The day had already moved on without him. On the 9th, the Soviet Union came into the war against Japan, and the Supreme Council for the direction of the war met for the first time since Hiroshima. While it sat, the first word of Nagasaki reached the room, and that first report put the damage as slight. 6 further reports followed it, each worse than the last. The Imperial General Headquarters record of the meeting states that the bombing had no effect on the deliberations. No surviving record shows the second bomb shifting the argument among the 6 men whose unanimous agreement was needed before anything could be decided at all. And they broke up with nothing settled. The question put to McDilda in that room in Osaka has a real answer now. The United States had managed 3 finished weapons by the summer of 1945. Its engineers fired one in New Mexico in July, sent one to Hiroshima, and sent the third to Nagasaki on the 9th, while the Council was still arguing. A 4th Corps was due around the 19th of August, with another behind it in September, and the material for that one had already started moving. The honest figure for that week ran to 1 more in hand, and a thin, steady trickle behind it, coming off a system Japan could not see, and had therefore no way to rate. Japan's own working estimate came out at 1, on the reasoning that nobody could separate uranium in quantity, which was sound reasoning applied to the wrong industrial base. Where the figure of 100 traveled after it left Osaka is where the record stops being firm, and the limit is worth stating. The confession itself is well attested, resting on McDilda's own post-war account and on the American reconstructions built from it. The claim that the war minister carried the number into the cabinet on the 9th gets repeated everywhere, and it traces back through popular retellings rather than to any Japanese document naming a captured pilot as its source. The confession happened. Its route into the deliberations of the Big Six has never been established, and anyone telling this as the lie that ended the war is claiming more than the paper will carry. Nothing stopped while any of it was going on. The very long-range sweeps went out from Iwo Jima again. The council met on the 10th, and again after that, and the argument between the men who wanted terms and the men who wanted one more battle on the beaches ran another 5 days with the bombers overhead throughout. Nishina's findings sat in a file, correct and insufficient. The scientist from City College went back to whatever he had been doing before. McDilda stayed in his cell in Tokyo, a few miles and one enormous piece of misinformation away from the room where it was being settled. And nobody in that room was waiting to hear from him.